All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the private well class webinar today on groundwater and well construction 101. These are hosted through the Illinois State Water Survey at the University of Illinois, and we're partnered with the Rural Community Assistance Partnership with funding from US EPA. We've been running this program for 12 years, working with RCAP, and yeah, I'll get into who both and all of us are here in a second. Thanks for joining us. So this is part of a national program funded through US EPA to support private well owners. First and foremost, to help them understand how to take care of their well, not only for well and public health protection, but also aquifer protection and maintaining source water protection. So this webinar does follow some of the material in the private well class, which these webinars are not the class. There is a 10-lesson class, which I'll talk about later. If you go to privatewellclass.org, you'll see it has a button that says, basically take our class. It's free. It sends a PDF to you once a week for 10 weeks. And I'm going to say several times today, going through the class lessons will help you immensely. For many of you, with the questions you asked today, would have been answered there. And so my advice is to sign up for the class. It doesn't cost you anything. It's delivered right to your mailbox. And so as we go through this today, if there's questions that come up, you all realize that you are given an opportunity to ask questions in advance. So we went through those. And we'll answer some of those. There were way too many to actually answer all on this webinar, but we will spend some time in the last 45 minutes or so answering questions either that you've asked prior to today when you signed up, or if you have questions today while we're going through the webinar, put them in the chat or the question box on your GoToWebinar window, and we'll make a list of those and pull them up at the end, okay? If you are a professional or environmental health professional or someone who can get credit through the National Environmental Health Association for this webinar, we provide free continuing education credit through NEHA. Their schedule is a 2-year license renewal, and so you can't take this class more than once during your 2-year renewal. And so if your renewal just started 10/1/24 and you take this class today, you can't take it again until 10/1/26. If you're in the middle of your 2-year cycle, I've listed the dates of the past webinars on this topic that are within the last 2 years. So we're also an Illinois LEHP provider. We are in Illinois. We're part of the university and the state. We work with our county health departments on a regular basis. We don't have the bandwidth to become a provider in every state. I know there's other states that have asked, and that's just a matter of not having that capacity yet. So, but we can give you, if you email us at info@privatewellclass.org, is the information you need, completed NEHA forms. I believe in your GoToWebinar window, there's 2 handouts. If you are interested in getting a certificate and some of those things, check those out. And we can also get you a copy of the slide deck in the end. You just have to ask. And we are a small team. And so as these webinars become more popular, sometimes we have well over 100 requests for certificates and CEUs and NEHA forms. That takes us some time, so be patient. Thank you. That's really, I guess, the majority of what I needed to say there. So I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the Water Survey. I've been here forever, for over 30 years. I work with well owners every day. We do a lot of really cool research related to groundwater and private wells. It's a pretty fun place to work. And Katie Buckley's with me. She's our water research engagement specialist. So when you ask questions in the chat or the question box, she's keeping track of all those. She's also the person who assists with certificates, and so she'll be helping you down the road if you do request those things. We started a hotline and help center through US EPA. It's on their website, or a link is, I should say. And Sally Dolan and Aaron Huggett are managing that effort. It's a national program, and so we'll talk more about that too near the end. But if you, yeah, you can go, it's on our front page, and there's a link to it there. And so they're the person you get when you call our hotline number if you have an issue you need help with. Okay, RCAP. So I mentioned the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. So they're made up of 6 regional nonprofits. Those are their names there on the map. So for instance, we're in Illinois. It's the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership. That their headquarters is in Ohio, but they have staff in every state. Like in Illinois, where we are, they have 5 staff. They're mostly water and wastewater operators who help small communities, but they also have private well specialists. We're fortunate to have a team. There's probably 14 or 15 people total that work on private well issues around the country through the RCAP regions. And so if you would like one-on-one support or have questions, or if you're a professional and you want to set up, like if you're with a local health district and you want to set up an evening workshop for well owners, we can get you in touch with the RCAP folks in your state, and they can either help set up those workshops, provide speakers, help get the word out, as we would the same here at Private Well Class. And so the other service is a well assessment tool. So it's meant to be a way for someone to come out who understands a lot about wells and actually provide advice to you as a well owner about any vulnerabilities or issues they notice, or we've seen things from a Folgers can as a well cap to having somebody's dog tied to the well and it's all bare around it, to a lot of different oddities, if you will, that aren't necessarily safe to do around a well, or what kind of plumbing you have, do you use backflow devices, all kinds of information that then they'd put on this assessment and provide it back to you with advice and information and suggestions, like and best practices, like why you need to test for coliform nitrate every year, and why you should test for other things every 3 to 5 years, all of that sort of stuff. It's really an opportunity. It's completely free because EPA funds it, and they're not EPA employees. They're with the RCAP region, so they're their technical assistance provider, and they're trying to help you. So this is just a front page of the well assessments, also for Springs, but it goes through, there's 18 sections. You really do have to have a lot of wherewithal to fill this out, so it's not something a homeowner could do on their own. And as there's questions and you go through them, it's an opportunity then to ask, why is this important? I know someone asked a question about generators today, which I'm going to answer later, but that's a question on the assessment tool. Do you have a generator? How far are you from a public water supply? Both of those things are relevant in some situations. So it's really, if you're a professional, it's like a sanitary survey, which is something that's required by law for public water supplies. And but it's not, this is all voluntary and it's confidential. RCAP will hand this back to you when they're done. It's really meant to be an educational tool. It's a way to have a one-on-one with someone who can answer questions about your well, and also promote best practices, and also answer questions that you may not realize. Like, I know one question we get a lot is, well, if your well's marginal or you're worried about your water quality, some folks don't want to go to their county or local health district to get advice. They're afraid they would maybe stop them from drinking their well water. That's not the case. I only know of 1 or 2 local jurisdictions in the Northeast where the health district has that kind of authority. In almost the entire country, they may recommend you don't drink your water if it's got 150 ppb of arsenic, but they can't tell you can't. And so, even understanding that and knowing that your local health district is a great resource, or your county health department, and you should lean on them, is an important thing for people to learn on private wells a lot of times. So they've done over 3,800 of these assessments around the country, which is, a lot of times our state health departments or local health districts and local health departments don't necessarily have the bandwidth to deal with every private well issue. And so sometimes they'll call the RCAP region and ask if they could go out and do an assessment. As I mentioned before, they're also interested in developing partnerships with those who work with well owners, even a driller who may be having a spring lunch or dinner for all his customers. Sometimes they have speakers at those things. Somebody from RCAP would be willing to come out and talk about specific well issues in that area. So we've developed a lot of experience around the country because of these assessments. You learn a lot by going to 3,800 wells and dealing with all the oddities that someone's done to make a given situation work when it's not a typical well installation and things like that. So we're at the State Water Survey, and we're the only one in the country. I think there's another one now, but when I started working here, there was only one. It's a sister agency to our State Geological Survey. We're all housed at the U of I under the umbrella of this institute that's called the Prairie Research Institute, but it's the Water Survey, Geological Survey, Natural History Survey, Archaeological Survey, and the Illinois Technology Sustainability Center. I think I've got that wrong, but anyway. So there are 5 agencies, if you will, that are actually part of a university department, but we were formed in 1895 because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks. And so this placard is near Noyes Lab, which is our chemistry building on campus. And from that humble beginning, now the Water Survey has nearly 100 employees. We do a lot of applied research, and we take questions from well owners. We also house the state's well logs for the state of Illinois. And so when a well owner calls me, if they're in Illinois, I can look up and see if we have their log and give them advice based on that. We also have sampled tens of thousands of wells in Illinois. And so we have a lot of information about the water quality of our aquifers from that information. My point there, not to talk about us so much, many other states have a similar group, maybe it's the State Geological Survey or DNR, that have the same sort of data. And if you can find the right group or whoever houses the well logs in your state, you may be able to contact them and find out more information than you realized about not only your well, but water quality, what aquifers that might be underneath the land you own, and that sort of thing. So we also, I mentioned we're 129 years old, which is really cool. And so our files are full of all the community wells that were drilled since that time. And so they're full of pictures like this. It's 4 young men holding a drill rod with a bit on the end. I'd like to show this. Whenever we were trying to get back on our feet after the Depression, Illinois hired a bunch of young engineers to go out and do inventories of wells around the state. And this is a well log from the 30s about a well that was hand dug 135 feet deep 60 years before. So you do the math, we're looking around 1870. They used 2 buckets in a chain as a type of pump. Again, this is in the early 30s, I believe. I'm not sure if I have a date on this or not, but it should have been around 1933 to 35, I think. But the interesting thing is, one, if you've ever seen a dug well, I think that someone dug a hole that was between 4 and 2.5 feet deep, 135 feet into the ground. Pretty scary stuff. Yeah, March 1934. And the thing is, it says they didn't, the pump was taken out and a chain with buckets on either end is found to be more satisfactory. And when you think about that today, well, you drop a submersible pump in a well, it's pretty easy. But the pump they're talking about is the old hand pump, like you might have saw at your grandparents' house when you were a kid. And if you think about it, water level at 60 feet, I imagine we're looking at well over 100 pumps before you even get your first drop of water out of that. So I understand why a bucket might have been a better solution. But this is the kind of information we have for some areas of Illinois, just because of the longevity and the work we've been doing since prior to 1900. This is a well that was being put in for the U of I back in, I think this was in like 26 or 27. But the fact that they put those spacers on and welded all that stuff with acetylene torches and all the rivets, every 10 feet, they had to put all these rivets in to connect the 2 pieces of pipe. Quite a job and quite craftsmanship, I will say as well. So many wells, these are old, this is an old drill rig for Weldon, Illinois, which is a small town in central Illinois. Obviously, well drilling's changed since then. So as a well owner, the things to understand are really that wells aren't regulated. Once they're installed, most states have rules on how you install them, what kind of material, who can install them. Some states have rules that you have to test them, water quality when they're first installed. But after that, you're on your own. They're not regulated. And so a few states have differing rules whenever you sell a property with a well. But in general, if you buy a home with a well, and or you buy a home and build and put in a well, once that's installed and been cleared for use, it could be 50 years later and you've never had to do anything related to any regulations for your well. And so well water can be the best tasting, safest water in the world, but there's also contaminants that are naturally occurring that are colorless, odorless, and don't have a taste. So for instance, arsenic. It's fairly common in the Earth's crust. We find it in many of our aquifers. There are states where you don't find any, but like in Illinois and many other glaciated states especially, you find arsenic, and it can be not very high. The standard for a public water supply is 10 parts per billion, but it can also, also be really high. We've seen values over 500 here. In some states, it's been well into the thousands. And so you need to test is the point of that second bullet. You need to test regularly. You need to know what your water quality is. It may mean you don't have to do anything and you have great water, but you don't know unless you test. And if you have, well, we'll go into that later. So today, I grew up on a well, but today I pay $60, $80 a month. And I changed the slide. It used to say 40 to 60, but I have a teenage daughter. So today it's usually somewhere closer to 60 to 80, and I'm always yelling about how long we're in the shower. But that's a cost spread out over 150,000 residents in Champaign-Urbana and Savoy for maintenance, the sampling they do, having a licensed water operator who makes sure our water's safe, making sure that all the pipes and all the distribution system are there and we're in working order so that when I turn on my faucet or my shower, I have clean, safe water. And as a well owner, that's your responsibility. And so to ensure safe water and to make sure that your pump doesn't fail, or that you don't have, if you're pumping sand, for instance, eventually that's going to it's going to tear up a pipe and it's going to eventually start leaking. Some of those things, or if it's corrosive, it'll start degrading some kinds of pipe. All those things matter, and so you need to understand that as a well owner. So what we recommend, you need to, if you have a well log or you can find your well log, you need to understand what it means, where your water is coming from, as far as how deep is it to the aquifer. Most logs have a geologic list on them as you go down into the ground. Where your pump's at and why. Do you have a screen or not? We're going to talk about more of that in a minute. Do you know if there are any naturally occurring contaminants or water quality issues with your aquifer or water source? Your state resource agency, whether it be a DNR, a DEQ, State Geological Survey, USGS, and Illinois State Water Survey, we can answer those questions for you. And it's worth you finding out who the person is in your state that you can ask some of those questions to. It really is. Being inquisitive and understanding what's going on is important. So it also helps you learn to ask the right questions. And what I need to add to this slide is one way to learn to ask better questions is to take our class. There were so many questions for this webinar today that would have been answered for you if you took our 10-lesson class. I'm going to talk about that later again as well. But what it really does for you is it teaches you enough of the basics so that you understand when you have a problem with your well, what's going on or what it might be. You also understand your own situation better with your particular well and geology, so that you can ask the right questions when you really need help. And so, and the last thing, obviously, sample your well. We harp on that all the time. This particular webinar is about groundwater and wells, so we don't go into sampling a lot, but what we recommend is you sample every year for coliform and nitrate, not because they're necessarily harmful to you. Nitrate has an MCL through the Safe Drinking Water Act because it's a risk to babies and pregnant women because of blue baby syndrome. And coliform is an indicator of other types of bacteria. So we recommend you test for those annually because it means if you have elevated nitrate or you have coliform bacteria, that means there's likely a pathway into your well from near the surface. Not because if someone samples your well for coliform and nitrate and you don't have either, that does not mean your water's safe to drink necessarily. I mentioned arsenic earlier. There's a lot of other things. It's really meant to be a way to identify if your well has any issues as far as leakage near the surface or near the ground surface. And then also sample like every 3 to 5 years for inorganics, metals, all the things that just to have a good understanding of what your water quality is. So we're going to talk a little bit about how water flows through the ground. And this is covered again in some of the early lessons of our class, but there's really two concepts that really matter here. One is where's the water at in the ground? Water exists. This block is meant to be a block of sand. So the yellow circles there are sand grains, and the water exists in between all the spaces. So if you had a jar of sand, the porosity, which is the airspace, is close to 30% if it's uniform sand. So in an aquifer that's underground and it's completely saturated, that 30% is full of water. So if I have 100 feet of sand and it's completely saturated, if I took all the sand away, there'd still be 30 feet of water left. So that's why sand and gravel aquifers are generally very prolific and can provide a lot of water because they hold a lot of water. And so that's a measure of porosity is really an important concept to know how good an aquifer may be, how much storage it has. So that tells you how much you can pump and how much drawdown you're going to have in the well and the surrounding aquifer when you pump water. So you see a lot of irrigation systems along river bottoms. That's because those are sandy typically. And so there's a lot of water available for irrigating crops in those areas. And it's also sandy soil. So it has to be irrigated because the water runs right through it. The other side of that is if it's bedrock, it's a fractured system. If I had a big chunk of rock from in the Rocky Mountains or wherever, it doesn't have any cracks in it or anything, the porosity of that piece of rock is 0. Where the porosity comes in and where water is stored in a fractured system or a bedrock system is in the cracks and fissures and caverns and caves. So the bigger the fractures, the bigger the area that has a water holding capacity, then under the ground, when you get to a certain depth, it's all saturated, and so it's holding water. It's kind of like pipe flow. But what that means is you don't have a uniform amount of water throughout the aquifer like you do in a sand and gravel system where all the sand's the same, so there's water everywhere. It depends on where you drill your well, how many fractures you hit, and how much water may be available, as well as how interconnected those fractures are. So here's just some examples. I've updated figures for this, and I should have used them because the text is poor. But it does matter for unconsolidated, means it's like stuff you could pick up in your hands, and it's not solid like a rock is. So that's sand, silt, and clay. And depending on how that's sorted, a lot of times either alluvial means along a river bottom, where every time it floods, it deposits material. And when the glaciers melted, the rivers ran so high that there's areas much wider than the rivers today that may have these sand deposits from when the glaciers melted, hundreds of thousands of years ago. But how that all fell out and is sorted makes a difference on how easily water can flow through it, and whether it has secondary porosity. So with the rock pictures on the bottom, granite in the middle is usually it's the hardest rock, if you will, and it has fewer fractures. I know we worked with a guy that was on the western slope of the Rockies. He had, I think, an 800-foot deep well that was in granite, he got a half a gallon a minute from his well, and that's all it would pump. And so he put in a large tank underground, like a cistern, but it pumped continually into that tank. So he would have, 500 or 600 gallons a day to use in the end. And so it really depends on your situation. You may have sand and gravel near the surface where you live. It may be rock at the surface where you live. It could be sandstone, it could be dolomite, it could be granite, and all of that matters. I know there's areas where most of the wells are considered, quote, low flow, like the half a gallon a minute. They only pump at most 2 or 3 gallons a minute, even though they may be 400 or 500 feet deep. And so depth's relative when we talk about wells, because it really depends on the geologic material you're going through and how much water is available through those units on how much water you'll have. So as far as I talked about sand, silt, and clay, gravel, the larger the rocks, the easier it is for water to flow between them. And so gravel is really highly permeable, which means that water can flow through it really rapidly, as much as 3,000 feet a day. Whereas the particles get smaller and you get down to silt and clay. Clay is considered, tight clay is considered an aquatard or an aquaclude. It means it doesn't let water through. So it goes from relatively permeable at 0.1 foot a year to 1 foot in 10,000 years. And that's just because the particles are so small, and it's really hard for water to get through it. Ironically, clay could have a porosity of 30% too. It's just water can't get through it as readily. And most of the time when we find clay or silt, it's a layer that's between sands and gravels, or sand and gravel, and then bedrock. I guess that's not right. It's above sands usually, but it's a clay layer that was deposited, and it puts a cap on the aquifer basically. And on the rock side, which on the right here, there's a lot of different kinds of bedrock. Some are more permeable than others. Limestone, it's because it's easy for water to create like caverns and caves. A lot of times you find really large fractures, and so water can move through that readily. It's really like pipe flow if they're large enough and they're connected enough, water can just readily flow through all that. And we get down to shale, which is basically cemented clay that's turned to rock. It's again, 1 foot in 100,000 years means that water is really not moving through it. And so, there's a wide range of things you can find. That's the bottom line. And when the way I describe this, and again, I grew up on a farm, so we had horses. If you had a horse tank and you filled it full of these materials and then just poured water evenly across the top, this is what the wetting front would look like as it goes down. So if it rains and it's going through this material, and these are idealized, nothing looks this clean in nature, but as sand and gravel, it's just going to kind of go through and meander its way through down to the bottom. Dolomite is more linear fractured, and so that's why it looks like bricks in this example, but water's flowing between the pieces of where the fractures are. And then the crystalline bedrock, that's the same as granite. It's very solid. Sometimes you don't hit any fractures. The fractures you do hit a lot of times are really small. They may hold water, but it's usually a limited water supply. And then the last one on the bottom left is just meant to be a little more of a realistic diagram, because you don't have just one type of material. You could have 7 or 8 different types of material as you go down through. Some will be water bearing and some won't. And this is an example of a sandstone, which sandstone's the one bedrock material that could have secondary porosity and allow water to store more, so it can be a better aquifer than some of the others for bedrock. But still, it just depends on that particular unit and how friable it might be. And some of those things. So here's a better diagram. This is from, we took a diagram that was on the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, and we kind of updated it a little bit. But this is an example of what it looks like in Iowa and Illinois, if you will. So at the surface, there are wells that's a river. It's just a cross section. So it's like we slice down through the earth, right? So there's a river there, and this could be 200 miles wide, left to right, okay? You have all this ground that's sloping towards a river bottom. That could be the Mississippi that separates Illinois from Iowa. And water's flowing towards that, but there's sand and gravel and glacial materials where it says confining layer there near the top. And those little sands and gravels that are that other color, that's where you were going to find your water supply. And so that aquifer, the well that's at the top on the farthest right, that little half moon shaped aquifer could be 20 miles long and 50 feet thick. And I mean, that's a pretty good water supply, especially for a home well. There's also a water table in that shallow soil environment that's totally separate from an aquifer, or can be. Near the river, it's the same. Where that buried sand and gravel is, it's different. But then as we go down, we start hitting different kinds of bedrock. Shale, looks like dolomite, and then there's a sandstone where the well's finished. But when you drill a well, and I'll show an example in a little bit, in bedrock, you don't case it all the way down like you would a sand and gravel well with a screen. You have to leave it open so that those fractures can get into the well borehole, right? And so usually you put a screen that's only seated a little ways into the bedrock, and then the rest of that is just an open hole. And because it's bedrock, it holds itself open. So here the water could be getting, this well could be getting water from the sandstone near the bottom, the limestone, or the upper limestone. And so it's, and a lot of times those wells were drilled that way, where they are left open to all those units. And the only time you wouldn't do that is if there was a water quality issue with one or the other. And water quality can vary between those. And as far as how water, the hydrologic cycle is what we're looking at here, but we're not talking about the rainfall or the infiltration. But when water makes it to the water table and infiltrates into the ground, there's a lot of things it's going to do. If it's close to a discharge area like a river, a creek, a stream, it might only be underground for a few days or weeks. If it makes its way down through an aquitard, which is what those horizontal layers are that look like the gray shale, if you will, then that's going to add a lot of time to the travel for that particular water drop, down to millennia, right? Thousands of years. If it's only moving through shale at 1 foot per 10,000 years, and it makes its way through that, it's going to be underground for a long time. But eventually, it all discharges back to the surface. Again, it's part of the hydrologic cycle. And so how long that takes, we can date water using, it's not my area of expertise, but you can use tritium if we know it's more than, it's older than from the 40s when they started doing nuclear bomb tests. And there's other ways with like heavier types of oxygen and things like that that exist underground that you can determine age as well. And again, somebody from our state geological survey could explain that a lot better than I can. So as far as what you have where you live and where your well is, it's like any other mineral, whether you have oil or gold or whatever. If you have water, it depends on just how the geology is at your location. People who put in a dug or bored well, typically it's because there's no real aquifer, or it was done, more than 70 years ago. And it's a large diameter well, usually 3-foot diameter, sometimes much larger. And it's so water can seep in slowly, because the shallow water table will still provide water, but not at rates that would work for a small diameter well, 6-inch well or 4-inch well. And so you put in a large diameter well and water can seep in over that 3-foot diameter section overnight, or that sort of thing. If you do have an aquifer, it can be either sand and gravel, or it can be consolidated bedrock or rock, which we just talked about a little bit. In some cases, like where we're at here in central Illinois, we have a lot of topsoil, a lot of loess because of windblown soil from many years of being a prairie. We also then have 2 glaciations or 3 glaciations that have come through Illinois. So we have 3 separate layers that have may have sands and gravels. and then below that we have bedrock, which in this area could still be a viable water supply. No one really puts wells into bedrock in Champaign County where I live, because the sand and gravel wells and aquifers above it are plentiful and decent water quality. So you may not have a decent water supply, and that's just, you know, bad luck, if you will. It's based on the geology you have. We certainly have places in the state where you can't get water, or if you can get groundwater, or if you can, it's salt water from millions of years ago. Southern Illinois was part of an inland sea, and so some of the bedrock down there's plenty of water available, but the TDS is near 10,000, which is basically seawater. And so it has to be treated heavily to remove all that if you were going to use it. And so Southern Illinois, there are many more dug wells, hand dug wells, or cisterns, or rural water districts where they're using a lake, a large lake, to supply water through a whole county. So it just really depends. So dug and bored wells, I mentioned. I grew up on an old dug well. My grandpa hand dug in 1933. I mention that all the time, I know. But these are all examples of dug or bored wells. And as I said, they're large diameter. They're 3 foot or more diameter. And that's so they can store water, because water seeps into the well slowly. And so you need to have a volume there so that in the morning when you're taking a shower or you're running the dishwasher and all those things, there's enough water that it doesn't run the well dry. And then overnight or during the day when everybody's gone, it'll slowly seep back in and start to refill back up. And you know, there's a lot of variance there depending on the type of soil around the well and all that sort of stuff. But the one on the top is an old hand dug well, and probably hand dug by the farmer or someone in his family prior to him. It's in a pasture. The reason those posts look so worn are because cattle come over there and rub and scratch on those posts, as well as do other things that get on the ground and then seep in near the well. There's a field right above it on the landscape, and you see that house up over the hill. My guess is there was no water further towards the house, and so they're down near a small ditch where there's some alluvial sands that they're probably taking advantage of that, you know, may only be a foot thick, but it's enough water to supply a well for a home like that. It's covered with 10 and 2 by 10 and 12 pieces of wood, and then concrete blocks. Snakes, rats, any kind of insects can get in there, and they do. They fall in there and they die and they rot. We've uncovered some, really horrific examples of that. And when you have these old wells that aren't sealed at the surface, that can become a problem. The one on the left or on the right is kind of a standard construction for many years. It's 3 foot diameter tile. So it's like the tile that runs into the road so the water can run underneath the road, but it's vertical. And you just set those 4 foot sections on top of each other. They have a male end and a female end, so they'll sit and seat on each other. They're not sealed with anything so that water can seep in at those joints. And what that means, though, is this is a 4 foot section of concrete tile, and it's sticking up a foot above land surface. So the first joint is down at 3 feet below land surface. That's not necessarily protective. Water's going to seep in. You know, if they have a nice yard there with no weeds, they're spraying, maybe fertilizing, all that stuff. It gives that an avenue if they haven't done anything to protect it from having water seep in that shallow. And the one on the bottom left is also like the one on the right. It's just that concrete pad on top doesn't start until 10 feet below land surface. And so there's a steel casing for the first 10 feet and a regular well cap, and it looks like it could be a drilled well. And that's just another design so that the upper 10 feet can be filled with clay material or concrete, and it makes it less likely that water from the surface is going to seep down into the well. And so here's what those look like. The one on the left is the concrete pad on top, and you can see those seams every 4 feet. In this case, they put concrete around the well for the first 10 feet, And then below that, there's rocks around the well that the driller put in. This is a bored well, so that add more volume, because the water can also fill into those where those rocks are, and sand and gravel they may put around the well. But it's seeping in at each of the seams, and here they've got a submersible pump down further below, and you can see where the water level is, and that's also the water level in the water table. And then the one on the right is like the bottom left picture from before. It looks like a regular 6-inch drilled well, but in fact, and this is exaggerated in this diagram, but it's just meant to be a casing so that you can put, this says clean earth fill, could also be concrete, so that the upper 10 feet doesn't have infiltration from the surface. It has to go through at least 10 feet of soil material to get down to where it could get in the well, which, soil and especially sand acts as a filter, and so it certainly helps. Most of the bacterial work in the soil is in the upper, the black part of the soil, if you will, the upper 3 or 4 feet. And so, yeah, this is a tried and true well design. It's using this concrete tile and properly installing versus somebody hand digging a hole and putting unlined bricks around it, which, the unlined bricks go all the way to the surface, so water can get in from 3 inches below land surface in those cases. So sand and gravel wells, they have a screen, and that's because when you put a well in sand, the sand wants to just fall into the hole you're drilling. So you use mud when you're drilling the well with the drill rig to keep that hole open, and then you're putting a well in with a screen. And you're seeing this picture here is the actual well screen, and the area between those stainless steel woven bands is the slot size, and that's based on when the driller drills these wells. They collect the samples of the sand and gravel material as it comes up through around the well pipe, or not the well pipe, the drill rod, and then they know how big the gravel and sand, or how fine the sand might be, and so you size the screen to try to keep sand from getting into the well. Sand scours, you've heard of sandblasting. If you're pumping any sand from a sand and gravel well, it'll eventually wear out your pipes or ruin your pump. You'll lose efficiency of your pump just because the seals won't be as well done, or as fit as well together, all those sorts of things. So you design your well based on what you have. And they also put in a gravel pack, which you can see that diagram near the bottom. The sand is a different color right around the well, and that's because you pick a gravel pack is a very uniform set sized sand that you put around the screen, and that also acts as a filter to keep finer sand from getting through and getting into your well. All the time letting water still get in as you pump it. So the casing itself could be PVC or steel. PVC is cheaper. It's obviously not as sturdy, but it's a good alternative in most cases for a sand and gravel well. And it really depends what your driller's used to, and what well code might be in your jurisdiction. Here's a well log for Illinois. On the bottom right, number 24, this is a geologic log of what they ran through. So there was 2 feet of topsoil, then brown clay and gray clay. Brown means it's exposed to air. Gray means it's almost always saturated. So it doesn't have a chance to have any air, and that's just typically what you find. So they hit 6 feet of sand from 120 to 126. They decided that wasn't enough, which it's very marginal for a water supply. And then they kept going, and they hit deeper sand that, as you see, it says sand, tight sand, and then sand and gravel. So when the glaciers melted and deposited all this material, the largest particles fall out first. Because the velocity slows down, then smaller particles can fall out. So typically in a sand and gravel aquifer, the most coarse material is at the bottom. So that's why we see sand and gravel at the bottom. and that's usually the best place to put your well screen, because then you can keep all those fines where the tight sand is. That's likely very fine sand, and it'd be really hard to keep it out, no matter how small the slot size was. But here we have sand from 260 to 295 in total, and so they put in a well. And if you go straight up, they're getting the water from the sand from 285 to 295. Number 22 up there that says stainless steel screen, threaded, 20 slot. It's 4 foot long, and that's plenty of water. A 4 foot screen, and this is 5-inch diameter pipe. You know, with the right pump and with that much sand and clearly water, I mean, it'd pump way more than you need for a home. I skipped though number 23. It says water from sand and gravel below that. So the static water level was 159 feet. So even though the sand didn't start until 260, the water level in the well came up to 159. So that means that aquifer's under pressure. So think of squeezing a juice box. If you squeeze it too hard, the juice comes out the straw. So when you put pressure on the outside of a system or totally on a system, it makes the water level go up in the well. And so this is considered an artesian aquifer or a confined artesian aquifer because it's under pressure that causes water levels to rise up above it. So they pumped it at 20 gallons a minute. They didn't say how long. Usually they'd write in how many hours, probably 2 hours. And it only dropped 6 feet to 165. And so there's still over 100 feet of water over the, even to get to the aquifer, pumping at 20 gallons a minute, which unless you have livestock, you're likely not pumping nearly that. And most of the time what a driller will do is they'll put in a pump to test pump it like this. That's twice or at least more than the pump that they're going to actually install for the home. And so a lot of times we see they used a 25 gallon per minute pump, and then over here on the right, or on the left side, they put in this case, they put in a 15 gallon per minute pump, and they set it at 186. No reason to go down any further. The closer you get to the screen, the more likely to cause turbulence and stir up material, solids. And so you keep the screen as high as you, or the pump as high as you can, but well into the water, so you never have to worry about drawdown getting to the well. So yeah, so in Illinois, well logs are public information. You can get on, I'll show you an example in a little bit, but you can, you know, it's not anyone's privilege to not share their well construction information. We house all of these logs, nearly 500,000 of them. And if you want to find your neighbor's well log, you're more than welcome to it. If you don't have a well log, a lot of times we recommend you find your neighbor's well log, because that may be information that's useful to you to understand how deep your well might be, what kind of aquifer you might be in, all that sort of stuff. Okay, and this is just, they have their own software, and this is how they've decided to provide this information. I imagine this is also helpful with their clients whenever they drill a well for a homeowner, just to have this information, and so you can see it visually, all the information about it. And many, many years before my time, someone came up with the idea of calling our ID numbers for wells a P number. So this well is P483373, and this is page 2. That's what that means. So the other type of well besides a sand and gravel well is a bedrock well. And as I mentioned earlier, you typically don't have casing all the way down in a bedrock well because you have to hit those fractures in order to have water. Water just doesn't exist throughout. You have to hit fractures. So this example shows that, you know, there's a bedrock well, and then you can see, if you look closely, the casing stops 20 feet below the top of the bedrock. And that's, you seat that casing in the rock so it's solid, and then the rest of that hole was already drilled when you drilled the well. Basically, you put a 6-inch borehole through the rock, and you'll go until you hit enough fractures that you feel like you have a decent water supply. And I'm not a driller. I can't tell you how they decide that. Sometimes you end up with a well that only pumps a few gallons a minute. Sometimes you have a bedrock well that might pump, you know, 1,000 gallons a minute. If there's enough fractures, then they're connected enough. But you can see the fractures here. Our well has one larger fracture and two smaller fractures that intercept that borehole, and they're providing water to the well, and the pressure on the system is such that the water level in the well actually goes just a little bit above the top of the bedrock into the saturated overburden. And in this case, overburden is the unconsolidated material where the water table is, so it's sand, silt, and clay or some mixture of that. And this is just a typical diagram of what that might look like. The difference is because, let's say only this one large fracture is providing all the water to the well, where that fracture goes in space, both into the board and up and in all three directions, has a big effect on water quality, what it's connected to. It may be that there's a place where the bedrock actually outcrops to the surface and that fracture goes right up along with it. That means your well could be getting water from near the surface, even though, you know, I have people call me all the time and say, well, I've got a 400-foot bedrock well, you know, so it's got to be safe. Well, if you look at the log, it may be that there's only 30 feet of casing. So that means the well is open to water anywhere from 30 feet down to 400. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the depth doesn't matter, casing matters, and especially solid casing. And so in a 400-foot sand and gravel well, the only place water can get into the well is that last 4 feet. Like the example we looked at a minute ago, it wasn't 400 feet deep, but the well screen was only 4 feet, and it's the bottom 4 feet. Where in a bedrock well, this might be 30 feet into the rock total from the surface, and the other from 30 feet down to 400, water can get in anywhere because it's just a hole in the rock. And so it really matters, and that's why you need to understand those things. Why I said earlier, you need to know if you have a screen. It means typically you'd have a bedrock or a sand and gravel well, not always, but generally. So here's an example of a bedrock well, and this is for a small camp up near Chicago. If you look again at the well log, the geologic log, they hit shale at 257, and so they stopped. I mean, right, shale is not an aquifer, it does not have water in it. So the person who filled this log out actually made a mistake. It's probably somebody in their office. The water is actually coming from the limestone. That's from 189 to 257, not from shale, from 257 to 260. Usually they finish the well in the aquifer, so they're assuming that the bottom unit is where the water is coming from, whoever filled this out. But similarly, the static water level is 130 feet, even though there's clay, sand, and boulders from 145 to 175. And so that means this is also artesian, and it's got pressure on the system. And when they pumped it at 25 gallons a minute, it dropped to 160. Okay, so in the end, they only put in a 12 gallon per minute pump. And so they set it at 160, knowing that pumping it at half the rate, it's not going to get that low. Very unlikely. And the other interesting thing here is if you look at the casing in liner number 15, it's 5-inch. They use PVC for the first 179 feet, which is 10 feet above the bedrock. And then they use 20 feet of black steel and seated that in the bedrock. And that's, you have to torque the pipe to really seat it, and PVCs could break. And so to save money though, they only use black steel for the bottom 20 feet, and then the rest of it's PVC to the surface. But this well's 260 feet deep, and the water's coming from 189 to 257, and yet there's only 199 feet of pipe. So it's kind of a really good example of how most wells, bedrock wells, are put in. Okay, so we have lots of issues related to water quality, and what it comes down to are these things: water quality and public health protection and source water protection. We hear a lot of things in the news, and a lot of things may be going on even with the public water supply, but that doesn't necessarily mean it affects your private well. So for in the news, whenever there's a drought, whenever there's flooding, obviously those things can be a real problem. This is a well that's near where I grew up. And because those trees are lining a ditch that can flood, they put the casing 8 feet above land surface, and that's above the floodplain. So if this area floods, water still cannot get into that well. It's welded steel. And unless the annulus, which is the area around the casing, the borehole has to be a little larger than the well you're going to put in, and then you backfill around the casing with clay or cement to seal it. If for some reason that annulus wasn't sealed properly, then water could go around the outside of the pipe and get down into an aquifer. But typically that's not going to happen. But it just brings to mind there are ways to deal with all these situations. I mentioned boilers here because I work a lot with water operators as well, and especially in some small towns, if they have a main break and they have to issue a boil order where they fix the pipe, that's because it means that things can get into the water line when the pipe's broken. And so to protect all the customers and protect our health, they have to issue a boil order for that area whenever the pressure is not maintained in the system. But that has nothing to do with the aquifer or a well. And yet I bring that up because I've had a number of water operators tell me that whenever they issue a boil order, they get calls from some of the folks that live out in the country near those towns asking if it's going to affect their water supply, not understanding the difference. And so sometimes these things are, they're not a threat at all, but unless you understand all those issues, it might be that you think it could be, right? And so flooding is obviously a big problem these days. It's happening more and more and more. If a well is overtopped, even if it's properly constructed and properly sealed, we always recommend that you disinfect a well. But as far as drought, it really depends on how resilient your aquifer might be, how deep it is, how protected from the surface, how much recharge it gets. All those things play into, there's obviously more pumpage during a drought. Communities pump more, irrigators pump more, homeowners pump more, right? And so they all can affect the normal balance in a aquifer system. We find though, the biggest issues are that there's so many wells that are poorly constructed that are, whenever well construction code came into play in the 60s through the 90s in various states, all the old wells were grandfathered in. If you already had a well, you didn't have to meet code. Just any new well that was constructed did. So what we see today is most of the problems, or a lot of them, come from these older wells that wouldn't meet well construction code today. And that varies by state. There's 2 states that don't have well construction code, which is sad. But then the other thing is just how much people don't understand about their well and how to take care of it. There's really a lack of well owner knowledge and education on, the responsibilities of being a well owner. And so that's where we found our niche and why our program has been so successful. And, we're after bringing the level of everyone up to a point where at least everyone understands what kind of risks there might be, why you need to sample, those sorts of things. But if you're someone who works with well owners, it's really important that you try to develop a program that helps them learn and grow as far as being a well owner. The other thing is I mentioned poor well construction. Even where we have well construction code, a lot of those are less than 30 years old, or they haven't been updated in a long time. And again, existing wells have been grandfathered in. We still find wells in pits, which if you're in a cold climate where you have a frost line in the winter under the ground, wells used to be put in pits that were below the frost line so that the well wouldn't freeze or the pipes wouldn't freeze coming out of the top of the well. In the early 60s, someone developed a pitless adapter, which I showed on some of those diagrams. It's basically an elbow that seats into the well so that the pump can be down below and the drop pipe that delivers water up to near the surface can then elbow below ground and go into your house below the frost line. But we still see wells in pits, and we also see a lot of hand dug wells that are not properly constructed in any way, and those lead to a lot of health problems and water quality issues. And not only are they an opportunity for surface contamination and poor water quality, but they can also be a safety hazard. And so the picture, I'll go with the goat picture on the right first. I was down in Southern Illinois. I was giving a talk at an extension office to a bunch of irrigators, and the only place to stay was this bed and breakfast. So that's where I stayed. Very small population down there. Anyway, Don Kelderman was there researching his family history. He'd found a family cemetery in the woods somewhere where he was at in the Shawnee National Forest, and he came across this old stone well that someone had put a concrete tile, which is what he's looking down in, over top of vertically, but it's only a foot above land surface and it's not covered. So this poor goat made its way into that well and never was found, and he got this picture. And you think this is a one in a lifetime type of situation. It is not. We've snakes, frogs, horses, you name it. It's really a problem. And it's, so for instance, the well on the left, this is from the Washington State Department of Ecology, which in Washington State is the state agency that regulates drillers and well construction. They had a blog, I'm not sure if they still do, but when they were running their blog, they put posts up like this one, where there's just, this is a little well house. It's actually very similar to the well house that I grew up on. It's a little building with a large hole in the middle for the well. It wasn't corrugated pipe, it was old brick, but it's the same type of thing. Anyway, that piece of plywood, she stepped on it and it broke, and she fell in and it killed her. And you can see that the gray stuff that's around the bottom on the floor, it's likely old insulation or insulation that's been chewed on by mice and rats. There's a little funnel there, probably for oiling the motor. It's just laying next to the thing. Not a good situation. I'm sure if even before she fell in there, if you look down in that well with a flashlight, you'd see all kinds of floaties on the surface of that well. Just totally unsafe and unhealthy. And in this case, not having properly, having a proper well seal at the top and having this protected in some way, this well just should never be used. It should be abandoned, and a different type of well should be put in place. But that's what can happen, and it does more than you think. So if you have one of these old wells, what we recommend is try to bring it up to code. Extend the pipe to the surface if it's in a pit, and then fill that all in with clay grout. And talk to your well authority or a well driller or contractor. Talk to county extension or your county health department or local health district. They may have some ideas, but using one of these wells is a risk. And leaving one, drilling a new well and then leaving the old one, well, I'm just going to use it for my garden, or I might want to water my trees someday or whatever. That rarely ever happens, and those things end up being a real safety hazard as well. So, which they're called abandoned wells. And because well logs weren't required until at least the 60s and many times 80s or later, there's so many old wells out there that we don't know about. Some people think there's as many wells in use, or there are as many abandoned wells not in use than as there are wells that actually are. And they're just a safety hazard, and they're a potential source of contamination. And if you have one, whether someone's on your property and they're not supposed to be or not, if somebody falls in that thing and it kills them or hurts them, you're going to get sued. Or we've also run into cases where people just start throwing their junk down these old large diameter wells, old cans, even pesticide cans, things like that. If that ends up contaminating an aquifer and the family down gradient from you gets sick because of it, and they find that in their well, you're going to be liable. And so the best thing to do is to seal it and fill it in with clay grout or cement. Most states have documentation and rules on how to do that. If you don't know or can't find those, you can always contact us and we'll help you find that information. So, and if you're in Iowa, you're very lucky. They have a program that their state legislator initiated in the 80s that gives funding to their county health departments to help pay for things like abandoning wells. And so, and that's the only state I know that does that. But they're, it's not that expensive, and it's really important to both protect someone from getting hurt, as well as water quality issues or contaminating an aquifer. It's so much more expensive to clean up an aquifer that's been contaminated than to keep the contamination from getting there in the first place. That's just, there's all those remediation projects and all these Superfund sites and all these things. Some of them have been going on for 20 or 30 years, like pump and treat, trying to treat the water. And, it's millions and millions of dollars that have put many businesses out of business. So yeah. These two pictures are also from the Washington State Department of Ecology. The upper one obviously is a horse that fell into a well. Hopefully that doesn't have any broken legs. And the bottom one is in Sheldon, Washington. This guy fell into a well 45 feet. He was walking in his backyard and had no idea there was a well back there. Bought the property, no one knew it was there, and he fell through, probably a thin soil, and fell into this well. They pulled him out and he walked away. And very, very lucky. So, and these newspaper clippings are all, back in the 90s, Illinois had a groundwater education coordinator at DNR. It was great. He went around and worked at schools. He provided all kinds of resources to teachers. And then, of course, DNR cut that position. But these are some of the materials he had and passed around. In the early 90s, that's before there was really internet use. Folks in Buffalo Grove, this 10-year-old girl died, didn't know that someone in Sangamon County near Springfield also died from falling in a well. I mean, nowadays that's when some of that happens. If you're paying attention, you see those things. But it happens a lot more, it certainly used to, than people understand. And if you're old enough to remember Jessica McClure, she was a little girl in Texas who fell into a well and was trapped overnight. I can't remember how long it took, like 24 hours to dig her out. Now she's a grown mother of 3. And yeah, that's really a danger. And if you know of any of those kind of wells, you need to either really consider filling it in, and or if it's not yours, talking to someone who it does belong to about getting that done, because it's a risk to pets, to animals, to people, all those things. So a little more about groundwater. This is meant to be more of a class on basic groundwater principles. So we're going to talk about what an aquifer is versus an aquitard. So, sand and gravel is an aquifer, fractured bedrock is an aquifer. That means that formation, that geologic formation, will yield enough water to be a source of supply for a well, versus an aquitard, which means it won't. It means it only pumps, if it pumps any, like the soil for where you put in a dug well near the surface, a lot of times there's no sand and gravel well there, there's no bedrock well there. It's a large diameter well because it has to store water. It won't let water move fast enough to actually be usable to a pump while it's on in a well. And so an aquitard is really, the finer materials or the solid rock that doesn't let water get through it, or not in a quantity that promotes well use. The funny thing is, and this isn't relevant to most of us, but we see different, geology and hydrogeology and engineering groups try to come up with a single definition of aquifer. And in the end, what I might, if I find on my property, I can put in a well that'll pump maybe 10 or 15 gallons a minute, but it won't pump 25, even though the pump would. And because the aquifer isn't that good, that's an aquifer to me, but to the city of Champaign, that's not an aquifer. I wouldn't say it's an aquitard either, though. But that's what that point is there. And I've used this for some other things. It really depends on what your use is, whether you consider it a useful aquifer or not. It's probably the better way to say that. And the other side of this is unconfined versus confined. So if you think, the best way to say this, I guess, is when it has a free surface so that there's air still in the aquifer. So if I have 50 feet of sand and the water level is 10 feet below land surface and sand goes all the way to the surface, the upper 10 feet of that sand is dry. And that's, so it's at atmospheric pressure. It's because it's not saturated and it's the free surface which, where that is based on how much pressure from the air is putting on, it's all the vertical forces that affect gravity and all those things. So that's called the water table. And above the water table, it's not saturated, okay? Where in a confined aquifer, the entire aquifer is full of water. And it's such that it's even under pressure, because somewhere else further to the left, right, front, or back of where you are, the aquifer is either higher up in elevation, or there's water coming in from recharge that's pushing on the aquifer. If you think about a bathtub, it wants to be flat. The water in a bathtub is always flat. It's because the pressure of the water on each other forces it to all lay flat. It's equal and opposing force and all that stuff. If I pull the plug on the bathtub, all of a sudden all the water starts draining. The lowest spot is at the drain, and all the water runs to it because it's trying to stay flat. If I plug it back up before it's empty, it'll create a new flat surface, but much lower because there's less water in the tub, right? So that's basically the same thing that's going on. When you have pressure put on the system, the aquifer is always full, and when you put a well in, you've created a place for that water to come up higher than the aquifer. At the top of the aquifer may have an aquitard that totally confines it and keeps it under pressure, and I poke a hole in it with a straw, and all of a sudden now the water can come up the straw. And again, it's like you're squeezing the size of a juice box. If you push hard enough, it's going to squirt out, and that's what a flowing artesian well is. So artesian just means under pressure. It doesn't mean the water's flowing out the top. Flowing artesian means it is actually flowing out the top of the well. Okay, so here's one. This whole thing is one aquifer, and the water table is where the little triangle is. So we have two wells, and then there's bedrock below that. So that's a very simple system. If I take those same two wells, but I have a confining layer, a clay layer, an aquitard between the two, they can have very different water levels. And potentiometric surface is just another term for the water level, but it's not the water table water level. So the upper well, the shallow well, is above the aquitard, and it has its own free surface. It's an unconfined aquifer. But the confined aquifer below is under pressure, and we know that because the water level in the well came up above the top of the aquifer into the aquitard. And again, if I'm going to go back. I thought there was a different diagram here. I apologize. If the pressure were high enough, that well could even be flowing, even if the shallow well isn't. So they're totally independent systems under their own set of pressure. And it's not mentioned. I'm not talking a lot about water quality today, but those two different aquifers could have completely different water quality. And so here's a well that's it's in a confined aquifer. And the water level is below land surface, and it's actually below the water table, like in the previous example. It could also be higher, and what that means is where the aquitard is, it changes the direction of flow. So if I go back to this picture, because the water level in the upper aquifer is higher than the water level in the lower one, water's trying to move down through that aquitard because it's at higher pressure. But in what I just showed you, so that's the same thing here. The upper hash marks are the aquitard on the top of the aquifer. Because the water table's higher, water's trying to move down through that clay. But if it were the other way, now water's going to move up from the aquifer through the clay into the water table, sand and gravel aquifer. And if there's enough pressure again, it'll flow on the ground. Hopefully I explained that well enough. This is a really good diagram to talk about all that. So we have here, the way rocks are laid and the way our geology was all laid down, none of it's flat. It's all at angles. That's why the mountains look like they do, and why you see in a road cut, a lot of times they're at an angle if you're driving on the highway and you see a road cut where there's rock. And so what we have here is a system where the bedrock eventually off to the right comes up to the surface. So the lower confined artesian aquifer, it's confined over most of this area, but on the very far right where it says recharge area, it's unconfined, where you see that dashed line. That's where the water level is. There's air in that sand above that line. But then there's a confining layer that's clay, we'll say. And so farther away, this could be 50 miles away to the left, you have a well in a water table well in the unconfined aquifer, and it's going to be, the water level is always going to be right where the water table is. And then you have the dash line for the confined aquifer, the potentiometric surface, which is the water level. It's the pressure head on the system. You can see the well on the right is artesian because it comes up through the water levels higher than the aquifer, but it's not flowing. But then down lower on the landscape, because the water, the landscape's so low there, then that well is actually flowing. And that dent in the dash line for the well is because if I had a well at every single location where there's a dash, that's what the water level would be. And if we didn't have that well there that says flowing artesian well, that would be a straight line all the way across, because the water level in that aquifer, if there was no pumpage, would want to be flat, or as flat as it could be. So, and that's typically what happens. And it's interesting, we have a few areas in Illinois where we have flowing wells. The state of Michigan actually passed a law that requires you to cap wells that would be flowing, because they were losing 28 million gallons of groundwater a day to flowing wells that then are ended up in streams and rivers and stuff like that. So it's actually pretty interesting how that all works. The water level in a confined aquifer is always going to be higher than the water table in this case, because where it's being recharged is higher on the landscape and higher elevation. And so it's the pressure from the right that's pushing, like I mentioned with the juice box, it's pushing water up into those two deep wells. Okay, so as another example, this is a real example, east to west, across Chicago from Lake Michigan on the right to DeKalb, which is kind of in the north center of Illinois. And so, we're probably 50, 75 miles across this. And what you see is, the shallow, the St. Peter sandstone and the Ironton Galesville are two deep sandstone aquifers that are heavily used in the north part of the state. And the red dash line are the water levels. So even though this is sloped from left to right, the arrows indicate the flow direction of the water in those two units. And that's because of pumpage in the middle. So because of the pumpage of Geneva and Elmhurst and Bellwood, water's actually flowing from beneath Lake Michigan in those sandstones to the west. And on near DeKalb, it's flowing east, because those wells are lowering the water level lower than, it's water's trying to get flat, just like I mentioned in a bathtub. The water in that aquifer wants to be flat, and so it always flows toward lower pressure. So when you start pumping a well, the well right near the well, the water levels go down the most, and then as you get away from the well, the drawdown is less, and water's trying to fill in. And that's also a measure of how good an aquifer is. It's how fast water can move through, like the sandstone, and replace. And that also determines how much drawdown you have when you pump a well, all those things. So here's kind of an example of that. So the picture on the top is a cross section. So the surface is at the top, there's a water table and a well. It's kind of like we've been looking at. The picture on the bottom is if you're looking down from an airplane, and those lines are of equal elevation. So they correspond to the picture on top. So at the well, the elevation of the water is at 400, and you can see from the top picture that's the lowest. And out where the water table is not affected by the well, where it's at the dash line on the edges, that's 460 feet mean sea level elevation, which means this well's pumping at a rate that causes 60 feet of drawdown at the well, and then out at distance, eventually it's not affected. And water's flowing towards the well because it wants to be level again. Water table line wants to be flat. And so if you keep pumping, water's going to keep coming in from further away. The cone of depression is going to keep growing from further away until it reaches a boundary or something else happens. You turn the pump off, and then it'll all come back. So if you have two wells, it causes more problems, because now they're competing for some of the same water, the water in between the wells. And again, we're showing this two-dimensionally, but it's really a three-dimensional issue. And so you can see how pumping 2 wells causes this odd shape of drawdown around on the bottom picture there. And then other things can affect it too. That last example in this one suggested that we have an infinitely wide aquifer, both to the left and right. But if we have a boundary, then there's not as much water available and it can't keep filling in. So we start seeing more drawdown where there's a boundary. And that's a real thing. Most of our sand and gravel aquifers are filled bedrock valleys where rivers used to run, like the Grand Canyon is a bedrock valley that was caused by the Colorado River, right? In Illinois, we have a similar canyon, not quite as deep, but it's over 200 feet deep in some places, but it's all full of sand now, and it's an aquifer because of glaciation that filled all that in. The other side is you could have a river nearby, and that's actually it's actually putting more water in. There's no resistance to flow in a river for water moving towards going into the sand and gravel. And so it acts as a recharge boundary and helps lift up, basically, if you will, the amount of water drawdown between the river and the well. And so all these things, what matters as far as how big the cone of depression is, how deep, how much drawdown there is at the well, and how wide that cone of depression is, are all dependent on porosity and permeability, which is how fast the water moves through the particular geologic material. And that's really what determines for your private well. I mean, you're not stressing it in particular. It depends on if you have a 5 gallon per minute pump or 15. If you have livestock, you might have a 20 or a 30. But what really matters is how quick water can replace the water you're taking out of the well as it moves toward it, and what volume of water is available around the well. How the porosity dictates how much water there actually is around there, and that kind of indicates then what you're going to see when you pump your well. And maybe there's cases where, like the guy in Colorado, he has to have a very low flow pump, or the water level will drop below his pump, and then it draws air and it starts sucking air too, and that messes up how the water comes up and causes all kinds of problems and can burn up your pump. And so he's got a very low flow pump. I think it pumps, like I guess I mentioned that, 1/2 gallon a minute. And that's so that the water level in the well doesn't drop below the pump, while at the same time, that's, if he pumped it harder than that, it would. So a number of states have tools like this one. I'm not going to show a lot of examples, but I'm going to show ours. We have another webinar where we talk about local information, where I highlight a number of other states and the things they have. As I mentioned, in Illinois, water well logs are public information. So our State Geological Survey, they're our sister agency. They've developed this interactive tool. It also links to the well logs that we have scanned at the water survey. But if I go into any area of this map and start zooming in, all these blue wells will show up. There's other colors, they mean there are other things like bridge borings or monitoring wells or whatever, but the blue ones are all drinking water wells, private wells. And so as I zoom in, and we're in Champaign County, that is our giant Willard Airport for the U of I and Champaign-Urbana area, I can click on a log or on a blue dot, and it gives me what the State Geological Survey calls an API number, which is different than the Water Survey's P number. It's because we weren't always in the same unit as we are today, but it gives you some information about that well. And then the blue highlighted API number, if I click on that, it tells me more information. Now, this is a generated log. This isn't the actual well log in this case. So the GeoSurvey has entered all of this geology into a database. They've changed some of the names to make them consistent. Every driller calls things by a different name. And so where they've had samples, sometimes they collect samples as they drill, and they'll give those to the Geologic Survey, and then they'll review those and then name this with a standard nomenclature, if you will. But this is a well from 1959. It tells you the location. an actual log like the ones we looked at earlier have more information on them. And what typically happens is we'll look in here to see if there is a log. And if there is, then we go find the one that was submitted by the driller with all the pump information and all that. And then that's what we usually give to a well owner. Some of the well logs, as I mentioned, they link to our data. So in this case, this particular well has a scan of the actual log as well. And so you can click on the blue squares there, blue outlines, and get to this particular log. And it's just a scan of the original log from 1968. So this happens to be a well that was put in 1968, and it's before this particular driller used a pitless adapter. And so they have a 50-inch diameter concrete pit for 5 feet, and then a 4-inch well from 4 feet, which means it's sticking up a foot in the pit down to 162, which whether that's still here today or not, or if it's been, this is a perfect example of if I was talking to this homeowner today, I would suggest they have a contractor extend that pipe up to 18 inches or more above land surface and then fill that pit in. Because it's just, yeah, I mean, when you have the well below land surface, some of the rains we have where we get, I know there was a rain that was almost 10 inches in 2 hours a couple summers ago here near Champaign. That entire pit's going to be flooded. And when a well cap is over top, whether it's properly sealed or not, it's likely that some of that surface water's got into the well and you need to test and disinfect. So my point with all of that was that a number of states have systems like that now. And so you should be inquisitive and see if your state has that, or if there's someone that can help you. I know, for many years, California was really protective of their well logs. When a well owner would call me from California and ask for me to help them, they had to go to their county health department and get their log and send it to me, fax it to me at the time, because the county would not give it to me as someone who lives in Illinois and is not the property owner. Well, all that's changed because of the laws that they passed there for the Right to Water Act and some of those things. Now, all of their information is online. It's really well done. I can find any well log that actually there's a log for any well. And so a number of states have put a lot of that information online. And yeah. So the private well class, as I mentioned a couple times already, it's 10 lessons. They're PDFs. We send them to you as an attachment to an email. You're on your own to read it. It's free. No one's going to call you and ask you, are you done with lesson 7 yet? They come once a week, over 10 weeks. And it's really a good resource for you as a homeowner and a well owner to better understand some of the concepts we talked about today, as well as best practices, common problems, issues with treatment, or why you need to test, some of the common things that you shouldn't have around your well, all that sort of stuff. And then we're also here with, we have an email address and a dedicated phone line, which I'll talk about in a minute, to answer questions and to try to help you find a local source of information. So this is the front page. It's just privatewellclass.org. And the 2 green boxes up there, the one on the right is to take our class, and the one on the left is visit our help center. That's new. We started that in April. And so it's amazing how many people have already used it, over 10,000, I think, so since April. But you go to this page, you can sign up for the class. This is the page it takes you to. We just need your email address. We ask for your first name, and then where you live is a drop down for what state you're in. And that's really, part of that is just so that we can show the people who fund us, that we're reaching folks in all 50 states, and not only all 50 states, but Canada and 12 or so other countries. We've had people take our class. So I think we're up to about 13,000 enrollments. So it's pretty good. We're pretty proud of all that. If you work with Spanish speaking or native Spanish speakers in your area, if you're with a county health department, we have a Spanish version of the entire class, including all the figures and everything else that go along with it. And so, yeah, we encourage you to share that. we certainly do as we can. It's not used a whole lot, unfortunately, but it's all there and available. And we have, I don't know, 5 or 6 people take our class every 3 months or so. For each lesson on our webpage, there's also a set of documents available that you can go on your own. So like for lesson 1's called The Science of Groundwater. We have all this, all these different documents that we link to that will help you understand some of the concepts that are brought up there. It's, it's not a heavy science type of class, but there's a few things you need to understand, like what we talked about today. That's as deep into groundwater science as you're going to get, really. But like these 2 books from Raymond Lyle, one is What is Groundwater and the other is Aquifers. They're from 1988 and 1992, and I still say they're one of the best resources for someone to read. They're so well written and they're so clear. We used some of that information in some of the figures we have there as well. And so there's a lot of extra resources that you can look at in order to learn more. And we also do webinars, like today's webinar is being recorded. And we did one on outreach strategies for professionals who work with well owners. And just show you as an example, funding and financing options for well owners. We've done this a couple of times. The last time was in 2023. Really, the only funding available is through USDA. There's a few other local, if you will, or there's just not a lot of funding. And the funding from USDA is actually managed by groups, nonprofits around the country. Some of the RCAP regions are actually provide that funding, and they're low interest loans. And in some cases there can be park grant depending on certain criteria, but they're really for low income folks. And so a lot of well owners wouldn't qualify, but it's certainly worth looking into. And we also talk a lot about in this webinar about other types of funding, not for a new well, but for testing, for abandoning wells, for whatever it might be. And the USDA funding is tied to the Farm Bill, which we are waiting until the new Farm Bill is released, which hopefully will be near the end of this year or so, because it's going to change some of the rules as far as who can get a loan and who can get a grant and what you can use it for. Like now, it's you can also use the funding for septic. The new Farm Bill, we believe, will allow people to, if they've tested and shown they have a contaminant, they can reach out for those funds, which is like 1% interest over 20 years to add treatment to remove whatever contaminant it might be. Lead is a big issue. Everything you see on the news is about communities and lead service lines for community and distribution systems. None of that's going to do anything for any home that has lead or copper pipes with lead solder. And so it's really a universal homeowner issue, having lead in your home, as far as lead pipes or copper pipes with lead solder or galvanized pipes. And so, but all the information that you need as a homeowner is in this webinar, as far as what the risks are. We had an expert from, at the time, Virginia Tech. Now she's with Northeastern University, talk about a lot of research she did, and how lead, it really is a problem, lead pipes in your home. And so if you have those issues, we encourage you to check out that webinar on our YouTube page. And we also have a page, it's just privatewellclass.org/lead, where there's links to some resources. For instance, the filters that you put on your kitchen tap, those do great at removing lead. And so if you have that issue, you can add an RO unit on your sink. That's a little more expensive, but those things, there's a number of ways to make sure your drinking water doesn't have lead in it. We also have a number of training videos, we call them. There's like 21 now on specific topics. What should I know about a shared well? A lot of people share their well with another home or many homes, and they're not considered a public water supply. And when we get calls, it's always an issue because a pump failed, and now we all have to split $5,000 for putting a new pump in, and 2 of the neighbors don't want to do that, or whatever it might be. And so you should know, if you're on a shared well, what your rights are, if you have any, and some of those things. Our most popular, or I think it might be, how does my pressure tank work? Well over 400,000 views. What we've learned from that is a lot of people have pressure problems that own private wells, and that's probably because of an undersized pressure tank or not having your pressure settings in the correct place. If you have a 2-story home, for instance, a lot of times there won't be enough pressure then to have very much water pressure on the second floor. We started a podcast 3 or 4 years ago. We've had 4 seasons. We interview national experts like Dr. McDonald Gibson. Jackie's a professor at NC State and has done a ton of PFAS research and working with homeowners with PFAS issues. Dr. Wolf is with Boston Children's Hospital, American Academy of Pediatrics, and he deals with situations where trying to solve a problem where some child has something that's unusual, and sometimes it ends up being a private well issue. And so all that's, if you're into podcasts, they're pretty interesting folks that we've been able to interview so far. And that's just drinkingwaterpodcast.org. We started a new website. It's our third. It's called decentralizedwastewater.org. It's really for the industry, so for professionals that do septic and on-site work. Not a lot there for a homeowner, but it's pretty useful stuff. If you're with the health department and you inspect septic systems or you approve plans, all that sort of thing, we've tried to gather resources in our resource library that are relevant for around the country. And we work with, again, RCAP has staff in every state. They're doing a lot of decentralized work, and check that out. Our hotline, when you click on Visit the Help Center, it takes you to a page that we built and we launched earlier this year. It's a phone number and a knowledge base and also a chat. And we put all of the transcripts from all of our webinars, all the information from our 10-lesson class, and a lot of like blog posts that we've written. So it's all our own material and things that we know are internally consistent. And now we're using this chat bot that takes all of that information when you ask a question and comes up with a developed answer. And it does a pretty darn good job. But if you can't find an answer through our knowledge base or through the chat, Sally and Aaron both are involved with this program. And if you use the phone number, you'll get generally one of those too. And they're both on here today too. But when you click on the Help Center, you get to this page, there's a phone number, there's a thing to search the knowledge base, and then there's a place to ask the chatbot a question. And again, it takes our answers, even the ones in this knowledge base, and comes up with a generated AI answer that it does like I said, it just does a pretty good job. So if I just type in the word flood, for instance, I get these different articles that are all answering a specific question. Is my well safe after I flood? How can I protect my well? What is a well vent, and do I need one on my water well? Most standard well caps have a vent, and that's important if your well gets flooded, obviously. But you can then, if you click on that top article, it takes you to the article itself, which was one of the videos that we have. Is my well safe after it floods? One of those 21 videos I mentioned earlier. And so it's really helpful. It gets you right to the topic you're interested in. And then if you can't find what you're after, that's what the phone number's for. And we've had some doozies because what we've learned is instead of people calling and asking, what should I test for? Because they can find that in the knowledge base, they're asking us questions that are complicated, that usually require us to find an expert on, corrosion or some other topic. And it's been an interesting experience so far, to say the least. So overall, our program is built to do these things. We want to make sure well owners understand, and we can give them direct targeted information and advice on why it's important, why their well is important, and why they need to know how it works, so that they can then use that information to help protect themselves and their family from risk. Usually water quality risk, but as we talked about, sometimes it's a safety risk. Not realizing that having that old dug well in the back and just assuming nobody's going to step on the plywood for the sake of stepping on it, is a bad thing. And so We're going to our questions that you all asked. The ones that were asked in advance, we've made slides for some of those. And again, if you have questions, it looks like we already have a couple that people have asked. We'll get to those at the end. So if you've asked a question in the chat or the question box, stay here. We'll stay and answer questions as long as needed. So yeah. PFAS. So obviously that's become a big topic. We get asked this every month now. And so what I just want to, and I'll show you an example in a second, but we did cover PFAS a lot last month in our webinar. So that video is on our YouTube channel, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today because today's webinar is really about groundwater and wells. But and so I want you to know that that's there. And what I suggest is you go to those webinars where we get to that page that says submitted questions, and then you can go forward. And I'll show you that in a second. But we did have a question about PVC lined wells. So when well owners have PVC lined wells instead of cast iron, should they be more concerned about PFAS in their water as PVC ages? So when I started looking, I didn't realize PFAS could be in PVC, and it actually is not. But several websites I went to in researching this said that PFAS can be in PVC, and that is not true. There is a PVC Pipe Association, and they have a really nice document. I realize it's a trade association, but they link to a lot of state agencies, including the California Water Board, which is someone I completely trust because California has a ton of resources that go toward their water and drinking water rules and all those sorts of things. They're folks that like you can count on for new technologies, whether they're good or not, all that sort of stuff. They're well in the game, and they're professional and all those things. On their website, there was information on how to sample for PFAS, what kind of vessels to use, what kind of fittings you shouldn't use, all that stuff. And they listed a bunch of PVC-like compounds that can be made into fittings or pipes, but not PVC itself. And it actually says PVC is an acceptable material. And so my advice, if you found something on the web that said PVC contains PFAS, it does not. That said, PVC stands for polyvinyl chloride, and vinyl chloride is a really nasty carcinogen. PVC pipes used all over the world, not only in wells, but for distribution lines, for public water systems. It's been determined to be safe. It doesn't, and when it ages, it doesn't release things that way. It doesn't get into the water and become, a dissolved contaminant per se, or it would not be allowed by the US EPA. And so, yeah, that's all I'm going to say there. But regarding other questions or more about PFAS, if you go to our YouTube page, so on the private well class main page, up in the upper right, there's buttons for all our social media, LinkedIn and Facebook and YouTube. When you click on the YouTube link, it takes you to this. This is our private well class YouTube channel. Every webinar is here. The podcast, we used to put some of the videos on there as a sneak peek. All those other videos are there. We've had 4 conferences, and we've recorded all the speakers. All of those are there. A lot of really useful information. But if you scroll down this page until you get to webinar recordings and click on it, you get this, which number 1 up there on the left or on the right is last month's webinar, which was for real estate professionals. Most of you, I assume today, I think there's probably a few, but most of you are not real estate professionals. That said though, we answer the questions we get every month. And if you go to this webinar, and you'll get this, we have to put this up at the very beginning because you can't watch the video and expect to get CEUs. You have to actually watch it live and be on our GoToWebinar platform and all that stuff. So we had to put this in front of every video we have on YouTube because people were calling us and wanting credit for watching the video. And we just can't do that because we can't track it. And a few bad apples there have caused it to be that way. But this is 2 hours and 9 minutes long. And if you go to 1:40 and 34 seconds, you'll get to the same slide that I just showed a minute ago, or close to it. Submitted questions. Right after that, the next slide is about PFAS testing requirements, about PFAS in general, and more about all that. And so, go back. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to go through PFAS today. There's so much going on in that space, and there will be for the next 10 years. But the point is, it's worthwhile to go back to our older webinars that are recorded and online, and they're not that old, they're every month, and go to the submitted questions part, wherever that might be, and listen to the rest of it. Because every month we try to answer different questions so that we're given a broad set of answers to people. And sometimes we get questions that I've never had before. And those intrigue me, to be honest. You know, telling people that they need to test for coliform nitrate every year, I've probably said that 10,000 times. And so that's not as interesting as some of the questions that maybe we've never had before. And it also broadens the amount of information we can put in our knowledge base so that people can find answers to a lot of these other questions. And so I'm going to move on, but I just wanted to make that clear that there's a ton of questions out there from our 120 webinars that you can look through if you just want to spend the time. So how would a consumer know if a well drilling company is good or bad? Well, and I want to say up front, like every profession, there's good or bad. And I mean, and that's in every profession. I've run across drillers that are amazing and went the extra yard, even do their own educational stuff for free. And I've run into some who tell their homeowner to pour a cup of bleach down their well every month and they'll be fine, not understanding that that's really bad advice. So, but what you're talking about here is you really need to do your own investigation. You're not just going to go buy a car without test driving it, or buy a home without having it inspected, you know, or, you know, having a lot of information about if they've done, you know, termite treatment on your home, or, you know, whatever it might be. You need to do the same level here. We're talking in some states, a well could be as much as $50,000. So ask for references, contact the Better Business Bureau, look for reviews, talk to neighbors. You can ask your state agency if the well drillers have ever been on probation or have ever had any complaints. I don't think most state agencies will recommend a driller. That's really not something we should do. We should be fair to everyone. So, you know, I don't typically do that. But I do know some drillers that I would never use, and some that I would, if they were closer, I would use every time. You know, I mean, that's just the way the world is. But I mean, most of all, this is about protecting yourself and your investment. So you need to have the contract that you have. It needs to spell out everything. And I would ask several drillers for a bid on drilling your well, if there's several in your area. I mean, unfortunately or not, a lot of times it ends up being they need to be closer, or even the mobilization fee will be a lot. You know, the very best driller in the country might be in Nevada, but I'm not going to have them drive to Illinois with a rig to drill a well. You know, it's just, you know, that sort of thing. But as far as the details in the contract, things like make sure that you get a copy of the well log, make sure they have insurance. We list some of that stuff and under this lesson 7, that's why I put this up here. This is one of the lessons for the private well class, and it talks about what a good driller would do, what kind of information they should have. You know, it recommends here that ask if they're certified by the National Groundwater Association. That certification isn't a mandatory thing anywhere, but knowing that they've went through NGWA certification process means they've went to the trouble to take classes and be better informed drillers. And so, you know, if I had 2 drillers and I had no other deciding factor, I'd always take the one that went through NGWA's program. But again, lesson 7 has that information. Yeah, that's all I can say there. Sandpoint wells. So can we talk a little bit about sandpoint wells? How are they constructed? When to do a sandpoint? Can you still drill a traditional well in areas where sandpoint wells are popular? You know, it's a shame that they're popular. A sandpoint well only works in an area where it's sandy at the surface and there's a shallow water table. And because there's so much water available in those type of aquifers, if the water table is only at 6 or 7 feet, you can use a sledgehammer and put in, basically sledge in a screen and and pipe and keep screen 5 feet on, metal pipe, 3-inch maybe or less in diameter, and in the end have a well that will provide enough water for your home. It's in a sandy area. Everything infiltrates into the ground. There's no grout around the well. So anything can get into your well from the surface. Most states or many states have outlawed sandpoint wells. A new sandpoint well, if it's already there, it's grandfathered in. People do this because it saves them a fair amount of money. The example I use is Mason County, Illinois. It's along the Illinois River. It's 120 feet of sand to bedrock. So the whole thing is the aquifer from surface on down, and the water table varies from 4 feet in some areas down to 40 feet. If a well owner asks me, and they're in the area where the water level's 4 feet, I tell them that they should get a well driller to drill a well and drill till they hit bedrock, pull up 2 feet, put their screen right on top of the bedrock in the sand. Sand's a natural filter. It's a farming area. There's tons of nitrate and pesticides. The cleanest water in that aquifer will be at the bottom, because the water has to go through all of that sand to get there, and it gets broken down, and the nitrate gets broken down, all that stuff. It's just, I would not ever put in a sandpoint well and would never recommend that to anyone. And that's my own opinion, but there's no way to protect it from a spill or anything else, or what somebody else does. If the water table's still moving laterally towards a river or stream or whatever, and so eventually you're going to get water that's coming from somewhere else. What are your neighbors doing? All that matters. And again, they do it because you can go buy this stuff to do that, like at a farm and fleet, and then it costs you $500 instead of, you can put a well in, a shallower well like that in sand for probably $5,000 or $6,000 in some areas, like in Illinois, Missouri. But in other places like California, it's obviously very expensive, but I don't believe you can install it in most states now anyway, legally. Yeah, enough said. We should get rid of all of them. My family farm has an old well and lack of records. How do I identify the type, depth, quality, and lifespan? So that picture is where I grew up. It's a pasture with livestock and a pond and that old brick well house. My grandpa hand dug it in 1933. It's 14 foot deep. When it rained hard, our water was cloudy. And so I bring that up because, what do you know about your well? Is it a drilled well or is it a large diameter well? You said it's old, and I typically think those are going to be large diameter wells that are hand dug. Does it still, does the farmstead still, does the water run? Is it working? Is there a pump in it? Does it have running water? I need more of the story in order to really give you any advice, but really the best advice would be to contact a drilling contractor nearby and ask them to come out and take a look. They can tell you all that stuff. As far as the lifespan, without any information, some wells last hundreds of years. We've run into wells, especially in the Northeast, the RCAP folks have run into wells that were put in the early 1800s, and they're still being used. That's obviously not typical. But, if it hasn't been maintained, and if it's set stagnant for a long time, it could have its entire own ecosystem down in that well. And it's going to be really challenging to bring that up to where it's safe water again. Because even if it's got a screen, it could very well be crusted over by now, or, sitting water doesn't do nothing. It causes problems. Determining well location. How do you locate the right place for a well and determine if there is water source there underground? So we have a webinar. We did it last time, was on February 21st, called How to Find Local Help and Information, where I talk about other states and the resources they have like we do. And the deal is contact a local agency or state agency like your State Geological Survey and ask them, tell them where you live, ask them if they have any aquifer maps. They may say, well, no, our DEQ does, or our DNR does, or whatever, but you can find information about the geology of your area a lot of times just by going online. The maps are public. I know our state Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates all our public water supplies, they have a site that's a GIS map layer thing where you can pull up all kinds of different information and look at it and zoom into your area. It's pretty cool. And so, yeah, you can find out even then if there's other wells nearby. You can pull, like if you were in Illinois, you could zoom into your area where you want to put your well and then look at all the other well logs that are nearby. If there's a 50-foot thick sand at 180 feet and they're all around you, then that's what you're going to do. You're going to put in a well, and it won't matter where you put it, other than the location you put it on your farmstead or homestead on your property. Obviously, it has to meet other criteria, like it has to be so far away from a septic and septic field. Our lesson discusses all of this, even shows a really cool diagram of all the things that could affect your well water quality and why there's setback distances in different states. Every state has its own set of rules, so you want to look at your states. But in the class, I use the one from Minnesota because it lists a lot of things that you might not think of that you don't want to have near your well. And so, again, I recommend you go through our class, and it'll really help. And once you've done that, and the same with all of these things, if you've gone through a class and you still have questions, or during the class you have questions, email us. That's what we're here for. But a number of the questions today, you probably wouldn't have asked if you had gone through the class as well. And I'm sure many of you are only hearing about the class for the first time today, and that's great. So, but I recommend you certainly take it. Is it recommended to have a backup generator in case of a power outage? Yes. I actually put yes here and walked away from this for a while and realized I didn't finish it. So yeah, I grew up in Central Illinois and on a farm out in the middle of nowhere. And we had an old dug well, and we were pretty far on the electric line rural area list, if you will. And in 1978, when I was a teenager, we had an ice storm, and we were without power for 7 days. So back in those days, our generator was a Honda motor with a frame so we could carry it, bolted to a piece of thick plywood that we had to carry out to our light pole and plug into a 220 outlet, and then fire it up, flip the switch, and it was enough to run our well, our freezer, and our furnace and our fridge. And so, yeah, my sister had a 3-month-old, 2-month-old, and they were totally without anything. So we had a family room with a glass sliding door and a fireplace, and we all lived in that for a week. So, it is important when you're in a remote area and you have a well, if you have a submersible pump and it's an electric pump, which they all are, you're not going to have any water if you don't have power. And so they're expensive today. You see some of these things they look like they're from Caterpillar and they should be running a bulldozer. And that's totally an individual decision. But you need to decide if something really were to happen where you're not going to have power for a number of days, then what do you need in order to be able to, in our case, the temperature was below freezing. There's a lot of issues there. If it's a power outage and it's in the 60s, it's a much different animal. So yeah, I say yes, if you can. Are private wells located in public right-of-way without a license agreement legal and the responsibility of the public agency? So yes, we put in a lot of monitoring wells, and I have to work with county, township, and state folks on the right-of-ways. There's two types. Sometimes they have a right-of-way that is for any purpose, and sometimes it's just for road purposes. When it's for any purpose, then, for instance, on a county road, the county can give me permission to drill a well, and that's it. Even though a farmer may own the land, because they actually own the land of the center of the road. It's just that there's an easement for the county, right? But if it's just for road purposes, then I can't put a well on that road ditch without permission from the landowner. So that's the way it is in Illinois. I'm assuming it is in most of the country. But in general, land ownership is really still belongs to the landowner. So even if it's a public right of way, that doesn't mean it's not your land. Maybe it's a mandatory easement, but it's not their responsibility. If I was the public entity and you came to me and said, you need to take care of my well, or I'm going to take you to court, I would come in and have the well abandoned and eliminate the problem, because it's a nuisance for me from the public standpoint, and it's not my responsibility to make sure you have water as part of the easement I have to maintain the road, if that's what it is. That's my take on all that. And I'd be glad to talk further though. You can call our number or email us, and I'd be glad to give you a call and talk about that further. Really depends on the state you're in though, and you need to talk to whoever does have the right of way responsibility. I'd like some insight into the fundamental similarities and differences between states regarding well regulation and compliance. There's a ton of differences between states. What's a private well? In Illinois, it's any well that serves less than 15 homes or 25 people, which is the rule for a public water supply. In Washington State, it's any well, it's only a well that serves one home. If your 2 homes are on a well, they consider that a special type of public water supply. So, that's how much variance there is. How wells are permitted, how they're submitted are different. Alaska and Pennsylvania are the 2 states that don't have well construction code and don't require licensed drillers to have to be proficient. I say that way because I used to say, well, Alaska and Pennsylvania don't have licensed drillers, don't require a licensed driller. That's not true in Pennsylvania. You have to pay a $60 fee to get a drilling license. It says right on their website, this does not mean that they have the competence to drill a well. It's just a fee they require to put a well in, and there's no continuing education, there's no test to pass. I could go there tomorrow, and so could all of you, pay your $60 and have a well drilling license in Pennsylvania. So to me, they don't have licensed well drillers. That's the way I look at it. And some just don't have the staff to enforce the rules they have. I was working in another state trying to find well logs. The state didn't have most of the logs to the houses I went to, so I went to the 2 local drillers. Both of them told me that they turn in their logs, but their competitor doesn't, when in fact, many well logs that they both put in, or that they both, for wells they drilled, that none of those were in the state's files. So it's, what do you do? Testing rules are different. So some states require some testing at construction, some don't. There's a few states that require testing if there's a property transfer and there's a private well, only 5 or so. And so, it's really, there's no way to give you an answer that's simple. In the end, the bottom, and there's also this issue of what water rights are. I can put a house on 5 acres in Oregon and then not have a right to put in a well because I was a prior appropriated a water right, where in Illinois, it's reasonable use. Anybody can use whatever water they want, and if you impede somebody else, they can take you to court and you have to prove it. And so there's really no water law per se in that respect. But the Water Systems Council has a document they've developed with all the well code regs and stuff. I'm not sure if it's exactly what you're looking for, but it'd be a good place to start. And if you email us, I can give you that URL. It's kind of long. But if you also just Google Water Systems Council state well codes, I'm sure it'll come up near the top of the search. I only have one more, I think. I'm sorry, we're running along. So my well dug in 1959 is within the city limits of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Since buying this home, I've used the well inside for showers and outside for water, fruit, and veggies. For the last 7 years, I want to find out if I could use it for drinking and cooking. So I see a lot of issues here. One, most municipalities, and I would guess anything the size of Sioux Falls, have regulations against private wells within the municipal water system boundaries. And so I'm guessing they don't know about it because it's probably illegal. The only way to find out is to contact the city. And you probably should, because if they find out, it could be trouble for you if you don't, and again, it depends on the municipality, or it could be a state rule. It just depends. It's so different in every state. Have you tested the water? Do you know what the water quality is? Our argument is that a lot of people don't test and don't test regularly and have no idea what their water quality is. And so if that's the case, you should be using city water for your drinking water anyway. You don't know if it's contaminated. It's in an urban setting. What I can tell you from, there's 3,000 wells in Cook County, Illinois, which is Chicago. They have a lot bigger, nastier issues from things like industrial pollution in the shallow groundwater and things like that. If you don't know what your water quality is, it really, wanting to do that to save some money is not necessarily a good idea at all, especially if you have any family. You're putting them at risk as well. The other stuff, I don't know, how old it is, how deep it is, how it's constructed. All those things matter. If it's an old dug well, I would leave it for your outside fruits and veggies and nothing else. In some cases, even the water quality is poor enough that it'll ruin your fruits and veggies. I've run across that several times where somebody was having problems with their either their garden or the fruit trees or whatever, and it turned out to be their well water. Our best advice, and one of the things we ask on the well assessment, is how close are you to a public water supply? Because in the end, a lot of times it's a good idea to use public water if you can. It's tested. It's, they're doing all the things they need to make sure it's safe to drink for the public. It's a much better option overall. If you're not on top of taking care of your well, you're not testing it annually, you're not, ensuring the type of materials you have, all that stuff that goes into being a responsible well owner. So then there's a bunch of general questions that I'm not going to get to, but they're fairly basic ones, if you will. And so, there is no average depth of a normal well. It really depends on your geology and where you're at. In some areas that might be 500 feet, in other areas it might be 50 feet. And so there's, it's like I used to say, well, if it's a shallower well, I've stopped doing that, because then I get asked, what is a shallow well? Well, again, it comes back to geology, what kind of, aquatards there might be that protect a certain area, whatever. But all of these things, these questions, if you went through the class first, you're going to understand how to ask a much more specific question to get an answer you're looking for. It just covers all this basic information, geology and aquifers and common issues. And then, I ask that you go through our class. So again, it's self-paced, you're on your own. And then if you have questions, that's what we're here for. I mean, we answer questions from well owners every day, and we're glad to help everyone. That's our job, and we really enjoy it. I certainly do. And so that's what I'm going to leave this on. We're going to quickly get to the questions that you all asked. Let me pull this over. Katie, can you see that?
Yep, it looks great.
Thank you. Okay. What standardized testing do you suggest for well water? I work for a health department, and we all offer bacteria and nitrates. Well, and we have a list. If you go to our common questions webinar, we talk about that extensively. I can't think of the name of the other one. We actually do one for EHPs as well. So there's a set of them we do fairly commonly, or common questions webinar, which the last one we did was in June. And we also do one called Well Care 101. That was last time we did that was in February, or was in April. But if you go to our YouTube channel, you can see all those. And if you're just scrolling through, you can see where we have that list and talk about those questions. And they're actually part of the slide deck, not something at the end. So, and I get that many health departments can only offer bacteria and nitrate sampling, or in the case of Illinois, our state health department, many years ago had a lab and tested for everything. And now they only test for bacteria. They don't even test for nitrates. So, it's about funding and what your state legislature and all those things, and it's really a struggle. And because private wells aren't regulated after construction, There's not the same amount of emphasis or resources put towards them as there are like septic systems, where you're inspecting and doing all those things as a health department. And so it's a really tough nut to crack, because in a lot of cases you just don't have the resources to do those things. So I certainly get it. And I'd be glad to talk. You know, we work with a lot of health departments. Yeah, and we'd be glad to help in any way we can. What resources or lessons would you recommend to a homeowner who is hesitant to seal a hand-dug well or keep their poorly constructed well for irrigation purposes? You know, if you're actually taking care of the well and you've made it so it's safe, that no one's going to get hurt and all those things, I'm not saying it's not okay to keep a dug well around, as long as one, it's not anywhere near your existing well and your new well, if you have a new well, and the where you're getting your water from in your new well is much deeper, and there's protective geology in between, so that there's no risk that that's gonna, you know, something gets in that well and dies and causes, you know, all kinds of issues or whatever, that it's gonna actually leach down into the aquifer. And so those are some things that, you know, as long as you're doing your due diligence, and I assume by irrigation you mean a garden, or like trees or whatever in your yard, because, you know, a hand dug well certainly isn't going to be an irrigation well per se for like crops. But yeah, you know, as far as resources, I don't know. You know, all the recommendations are if you're not using it, to seal it. And, you know, most states have laws that say if you don't use a well, you have to seal it. It's just there's no one around to enforce that, so it doesn't happen. But if you are using it, you know, then the other thing I'd say is, you know, I would be 100% sure that there's no way to hook that up to your house again, because, yeah, you don't want to ever have that issue either. So that wasn't real helpful. You know, Sally and Aaron might be able to find some stuff on that. We can certainly look. And if you want to contact us, you can just send us an email and we can look into that a little further. So what requirements are there for people who want to drill their own well? We have someone in our jurisdiction who wants to drill their own well. Maximum casing 8 inches. Homeowner will also be going through shale before getting to the aquifer. I really think it depends what your state requirements are. I don't know what state you're in. In Illinois, you're allowed to drill your own well on your own property for your own use, but you still have to meet the state's well construction code. So, and they have to submit a log, which it used to not even have all those other requirements. If you were on your own property, you can put in your own well, blah, blah. But that's how a lot of those sand points got put in some of those areas, and they're really not safe. And so I think you need to see what your state well code says. Or if, you know, I realize if you're out east, some of the local health districts have their own, you know, own rules. I know what we see in Massachusetts, there's 351 health districts, and the rules for private wells are all over the map because they have the authority to create their own, which is ridiculous because, you know, you have two sides of a street that are on a line. One has tons of rules and the other has 0 rules. And so it's certainly not a sensible way to do things. But yeah, I guess if you want to contact us, I keep saying that, I realize, but it really varies by what your state allows. Some states don't allow that at all. And you know, I don't know, maybe you already know all this, but the fact that they're going through shale really doesn't matter. Other than that means that there's a deeper bedrock that they're using, and you know, it's likely not going to have any anthropogenic anyway contaminants, man-made contaminants. But I would, you know, I would find out if there are actually any requirements, and then I would work with them to make sure that they're doing things the right way. Like, you know, once they install the well, they're using the proper equipment, they're grouting around the annulus, all that stuff. it's really not something for a homeowner to do, you know. I mean, if someone's a well driller and they want to put in their own well, that's the only situation that I see that it makes sense for someone to put in their own well. But yeah, I think the rules will dictate what you can stop them or not, or if they have to file a log or not, or any of those things. Are there any efforts in Illinois to standardize nomenclature for drillers when describing layers? What geological or soil education do most drillers receive? You know, I'm a big proponent of doing a lot more education for well drillers, because most of the situations I've had have been in Illinois, and it's honestly really frustrating to me. I know some really good drillers who I go to when I have questions, and then I have homeowners tell me, you know, the homeowner who told me their driller told them just to pour a cup of bleach down their well every month and it'd be fine. That was in Illinois. And I had another homeowner who was buying a property and asked us about what they should do beforehand before they signed. And I told him you need to have the well tested. And the homeowner who owned the property was totally upset by that, but agreed to do it. They found bacteria, so they agreed to hire a contractor to come out and disinfect the well. And this person who's buying the house went out to see that done. And the driller who came out said, you know, I really don't know what I'm doing here. I've never done this before, which is really frustrating, because we give out instructions that are based on Minnesota's rules, not rules, but a document they provide on how to disinfect wells. And it's the best one of all the 60 or 70 I've read. And so as far as your first question, I don't know. That would be our state geological survey, and I'm at the water survey. I'm not a geologist by training, so I've learned a lot of glacial geology over my 30-some years, but when I get into bedrock, I'm one lost as far as the nomenclature side of things. I certainly think would be a really useful thing. You know, I run into logs where it says drift, you know, 140 feet of drift, because they're going to drill into bedrock and the driller doesn't care. So he doesn't describe any of the unconsolidated material. So I don't know what geologic or soil education most drillers receive. From my experience working on this program for the last 15 years, we need to all do a better job of working together and doing that, so that everyone's on the same page, all that stuff. And you know, sometimes it comes down to resources. Like we've tried to get the Department of Public Health to consider making all well log stuff, like entering the logs for the drillers, all online. It'll save people from the water survey and geo survey from having to enter the data over and all the mistakes that get generated from that. It could be built so that if somebody puts a location that's actually out in the middle of the ocean, it'll flag it right at the time and say, oh, you got the wrong thing, or you skipped a digit, all that sort of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do. And if you're actually a driller in Illinois or work with drillers, I'd love to talk to you about, you know, I've certainly been to the IGP meetings and given a number of talks about our program and other things, history of the water survey, all that stuff. But there is no organized effort that I know of. And it would be great if they did. You know, the problem I see is some of the biggest problems are the guys that don't come to those things. Because I think, you know, when I go to like IAGP meetings, which is our Drillers Association in Illinois, by the way, you know, I see a lot of familiar faces and people that, you know, do things the right way. So yeah, probably more than I needed to share there with everybody. Sorry about that. Where should the pump be set in a well? You know, that's a case-by-case thing. And, you know, the main rules are you need to test pump the well so you know how much drawdown there's going to be. You want to make sure your pump, if it's a submersible pump in the well, is below where it's likely that the water levels are going to drop. You don't want your pump above to suck enough water that the pump is above the water. In most cases, they're water cooled. And also if they start, they reach the suction of the intake, they can start sucking air, and then that causes problems in your lines and all that stuff. But you don't want it to be down in the screen, because right where the intake is, it's turbulent flow versus laminar flow. And So if you have the pump set too low, then you're going to cause turbulence, and it's going to stir up the gravel pack, and could cause fines to get in the well then, or even sand. And so it's really, I mean, that's something your driller would decide when they've got all those, when they have all of that information. So, and if it's a bedrock well, you know, again, I'm not as familiar with that, but I think you'd likely, since it's an open hole, you have several different units that might be contributing water, you'd probably put it in the unit that's the most solid. So like a shale that's not going to create a lot of, you know, it's not going to have a lot of stuff slough off over time, so that you have less dissolved solids or total solids that are being taken up by the pump. That's my way to answer that. I don't know, what driller may have a different view or be able to provide a lot more detail. But in the end, it really depends on all the factors: geology, water level, screen, location, all that. So, all right, for those of you that stuck around the whole time, I really appreciate it. I'm sorry we ran long. A lot of good questions, appreciate it, and everyone have a great day.